when a chapter quietly ends. Sometimes the most meaningful turning points in life don't arrive with a loud announcement. There's no dramatic moment, no clear signal that tells you everything has changed. Instead, something subtle begins to shift inside you. The things that once drained you no longer hold the same power. Situations that once kept you stuck start to feel strangely distant, almost like they belong to another version of your life. It's not that the challenges disappeared overnight. It's that you've slowly grown beyond them. Many people notice this moment only when they pause long enough to reflect. They look back and realize that the person they were a year ago would have reacted very differently to the same situations they face today. The stress that once felt overwhelming now feels manageable. The confusion that once clouded every decision has begun to clear. And when that realization arrives, it can feel like a quiet but powerful conclusion to a long, difficult chapter. If you've been feeling a strange mixture of relief, exhaustion, and cautious optimism lately, you're not alone. That feeling often appears when someone has spent a long time doing deep internal work. Growth rarely looks dramatic while it's happening. Most of the time it feels slow, uncomfortable, and uncertain. But eventually, there comes a point where the weight begins to lift. Not because the world suddenly became easier, but because you became stronger. This moment isn't about declaring victory or pretending the past didn't happen. It's about recognizing the progress that took place behind the scenes, during the quiet moments when nobody else could see the effort you were making. And if you're noticing that shift now, it may simply mean that a chapter you've been carrying for a long time is finally reaching its natural end. The strange feeling of outgrowing old struggles. One of the first signs that a difficult phase is ending isn't excitement. It's distance. Things that once felt incredibly personal begin to feel less heavy. Situations that used to trigger frustration or self-doubt now seem easier to observe from a calmer perspective. You might even notice yourself reacting more thoughtfully instead of emotionally. At first, this can feel confusing. Part of you might wonder why certain problems don't affect you the way they used to. Another part might question whether you're simply becoming numb or disconnected. But often, what's actually happening is something much healthier. You're developing emotional space. Growth doesn't mean life stops presenting challenges. It means your relationship with those challenges begins to change. Instead of feeling trapped inside every stressful moment, you gradually learn to step back and see the bigger picture. This shift usually happens quietly. There's no single moment where someone suddenly decides to be different. Instead, it's the result of countless small experiences, difficult conversations that taught you patience, disappointments that forced you to rethink your expectations, moments of solitude that allowed you to understand yourself more clearly. Over time, these experiences build a kind of inner stability. And once that stability forms, many of the old struggles lose their grip. People often mistake this phase for boredom or emptiness because the emotional intensity they once felt is no longer present. But in reality, this calmness is often a sign of maturity. It means you've stopped fighting the same battles that once consumed your energy, the quiet strength you built without realizing. For many people, the hardest part of growth is that it doesn't feel rewarding while it's happening. When someone is going through a difficult period, it often feels like they're moving in circles. They try to make better choices, but progress seems slow. They attempt to change habits, but setbacks keep appearing. They work on their mindset, yet doubts still show up unexpectedly. From the inside, it can feel like nothing is improving. But growth rarely reveals itself in the moment. Think about someone learning a new skill. In the early stages, improvement is almost invisible. The person practices repeatedly, making mistakes along the way, often wondering whether the effort is worth it. But eventually, there comes a day when they perform the same task more easily than before. Only then do they realize how much progress had been happening behind the scenes. Personal growth works in a very similar way. During difficult chapters, people unknowingly develop strengths that only become visible later. They learn how to remain calm during uncertainty. They discover how to set healthier boundaries. They begin to trust their own judgment rather than relying entirely on external validation. These changes don't happen overnight. They form gradually through experience. And when someone finally reaches the point where those new strengths begin to show, it can feel like stepping into a completely different phase of life. The challenges that once felt overwhelming begin to look manageable. Situations that once created anxiety become opportunities for thoughtful decision-making. The person hasn't escaped difficulty entirely, but they've become far more capable of navigating it. This is why the end of a hard chapter often feels quieter than people expect. There's no dramatic celebration. Instead, there's a calm recognition that something inside you has shifted. You're no longer the same person who entered that chapter. You've developed resilience, patience, and awareness that didn't exist before. And sometimes, the most meaningful victories in life are the ones that happen internally, long before anyone else notices. Why letting go of old identities feels uncomfortable. One of the most overlooked parts of personal growth is the moment when you begin to outgrow the identity you once relied on. For a long time, many people define themselves through the roles they play. Maybe you were the person who always tried to keep the peace in every situation. Maybe you were the one who carried responsibilities that didn't technically belong to you. Maybe you were known for constantly sacrificing your own needs just to avoid conflict or disappointment. These roles often develop quietly over the years. At first, they feel necessary. They help you navigate relationships, expectations, and responsibilities. But over time, these roles can become limiting. They begin to shape how others see you and eventually how you see yourself. Then something interesting happened during a period of deep personal change. You start questioning whether those roles still reflect who you truly are. This realization doesn't usually feel exciting at first. In fact, it can feel unsettling. When someone begins to step away from a long-held identity, there is often a temporary sense of uncertainty. The behaviors that once felt automatic suddenly feel unfamiliar. For example, someone who spent years trying to please everyone might start noticing the emotional cost of constantly putting themselves last. They might begin setting small boundaries, speaking more honestly, or choosing not to participate in situations that drain their energy. At first, these changes can feel uncomfortable. Not because they're wrong, but because they're different. Anytime a person begins to move beyond an identity they carried for years, there's a natural adjustment period. The mind tries to hold onto what it already understands. Familiar patterns feel safe, even when they're no longer healthy. But growth requires space for new versions of ourselves to emerge. That space often appears when we allow outdated roles to fade away. This is one of the reasons a difficult chapter can feel like it's closing. You're no longer operating from the same identity that existed when the struggle first began. The person you've become sees the world differently, responds differently, and values different things. And while that shift can feel strange at first, it's also a powerful sign of progress. It means you're no longer trying to live inside a version of yourself that no longer fits, the moment you stop chasing approval. Another quiet transformation that often signals the end of a challenging phase is the gradual release of external approval. At earlier stages of life, many decisions are influenced by how others might respond. People worry about being accepted, understood, or validated. They hesitate to express certain thoughts or make certain choices because they're concerned about how those choices will be perceived. This is a very human experience. Wanting to belong is deeply rooted in our psychology. Social connection has always played an important role in human survival, so it's natural for people to care about the opinions of those around them. But during periods of personal growth, something begins to change. Instead of constantly asking, "What will others think?" the question slowly becomes, "Does this decision align with who I'm becoming?" This shift doesn't mean someone suddenly stops caring about relationships or feedback. It simply means their sense of direction is no longer controlled entirely by outside voices. The approval that once felt essential becomes less urgent. And when that happens, decision-making becomes clearer. People start choosing environments that support their well-being rather than environments that only offer temporary validation. They begin spending time with individuals who respect their boundaries rather than those who expect constant accommodation. This process can be surprisingly emotional. Letting go of the need for approval often reveals which relationships were built on mutual respect and which ones relied on expectations that were never healthy to begin with. Sometimes certain connections naturally fade during this stage, not because anyone is intentionally pushing others away, but because the dynamics that once held those relationships together are no longer present. And while that transition can feel difficult, it also creates room for something better. Authentic relationships, connections based on honesty rather than obligation. When people reach this stage, they often look back and realize how much energy they used to spend trying to manage other people's perceptions. Now that energy can finally be directed towards something more meaningful. Living with clarity when your perspective starts changing. One of the most powerful indicators that a difficult chapter is closing is the moment when your perspective begins to shift. The situations around you might not look dramatically different. Your daily routines could still appear familiar. The people in your life might still occupy the same spaces they always have. But the way you interpret those experiences begins to evolve. And perspective changes everything. For example, something that once felt like a personal rejection might now appear as a simple mismatch of expectations. A situation that once triggered frustration might now feel like a learning experience rather than a failure. This kind of shift doesn't happen because life suddenly becomes perfect. It happens because your understanding deepens. With time, you begin recognizing patterns that weren't obvious before. You see how certain challenges shaped your decision-making skills. You notice how periods of isolation allowed you to understand your own priorities more clearly. What once looked like chaos begins to reveal structure. What once felt unfair begins to make more sense in hindsight. This doesn't mean every difficult moment becomes easy to explain. Some experiences will always remain complex or painful, but growth often brings a wider lens through which those experiences can be viewed. Instead of seeing obstacles as permanent barriers, you start seeing them as temporary stages in a much larger process. That change in perspective can be incredibly freeing. It allows people to stop reliving the same frustrations over and over again. Instead of replaying old situations with regret or resentment, they begin focusing on what those experiences taught them. This is one of the most subtle yet meaningful signs that someone has moved forward internally. Their attention shifts from the past toward the present. And once that shift takes place, it becomes much easier to recognize that the difficult chapter which once dominated their thoughts is no longer defining their future. The role of solitude in personal transformation. There's a stage in many people's growth journey that can feel confusing while it's happening. It's the period when life becomes quieter. Conversations slow down, social circles change, invitations that once felt constant may become less frequent. At first, this shift can feel isolating, even discouraging. But solitude often plays an important role during times of transformation. When someone spends years reacting to external pressures, They rarely have the opportunity to fully hear their own thoughts. Their schedule, responsibilities, and relationships keep their attention focused outward. Solitude interrupts that pattern. It creates space for reflection. During quiet moments, people begin noticing things they previously overlooked. They start questioning habits that once felt automatic. They observe emotional patterns that shape their reactions for years. This level of self-awareness rarely develops in crowded environments. It grows in silence. That's why solitude often appears during the middle of personal growth. It provides the environment necessary for deeper understanding. Without constant external input, the mind begins organizing its own experiences more clearly. At first, this process can feel uncomfortable. Many people aren't used to sitting with their thoughts for extended periods. The mind may revisit past decisions, old conversations, or unresolved emotions. But gradually, those reflections begin forming new insights. People start recognizing which values truly matter to them. They begin clarifying the kind of life they want to build moving forward. Over time, solitude stops feeling like isolation. It begins to feel like preparation, a period where internal clarity forms before new opportunities appear. And when someone reaches the end of that phase, they often realize the quiet moments were not empty at all. They were building the foundation for the next stage of their life, learning to recognize what truly deserves your energy. As people grow through difficult experiences, one of the most noticeable changes happens in how they choose to spend their energy. Earlier in life, energy often gets scattered across too many directions. People invest time in arguments that lead nowhere, relationships that constantly drain them, and expectations that were never truly their own. They push themselves to meet standards that may not even align with their personal values. During a challenging chapter, this pattern can become exhausting. Eventually, something inside begins to question whether all of that effort is necessary. That's when a gradual shift starts taking place. Instead of reacting to every situation that demands attention, you begin asking a quieter but more powerful question. Is this worth my energy? At first, this question might feel unfamiliar. Many people are used to responding immediately to problems, expectations, or emotional tension. They step in, try to fix things, or carry burdens that don't actually belong to them. But over time, awareness begins to change that habit. You start noticing that not every disagreement needs to become a battle. Not every misunderstanding requires endless explanation. Not every opinion directed toward you deserves a reaction. This realization can feel incredibly freeing. It allows you to focus on what truly matters rather than constantly defending yourself against situations that have little long-term importance. Choosing where to invest your energy doesn't mean you become indifferent or disconnected from the world around you. Instead, it means you're becoming more intentional with your attention. You begin protecting your mental space in the same way someone might protect their physical environment. Unnecessary conflict loses its appeal. Endless drama begins to feel tiring rather than stimulating. And gradually, you start reserving your energy for the things that actually help you grow. Relationships that feel genuine, projects that align with your values, and conversations that encourage understanding rather than division. When someone reaches this stage, they often realize that many of the struggles that once filled their days were never truly theirs to carry. They were simply habits formed during earlier stages of life. Letting go of those habits can feel like setting down a weight that you didn't realize you had been holding for years. When your priorities begin to change, one of the clearest indicators that a chapter is closing is the moment when your priorities start shifting naturally. This doesn't usually happen through force or sudden decisions. Instead, the change unfolds gradually as your experiences reshape what feels important. For example, things that once seemed urgent may begin to feel less significant. Goals that once motivated you might lose their emotional pull. At the same time, other aspects of life begin drawing more of your attention. You might find yourself valuing peace of mind more than constant activity. You might become more interested in meaningful conversations rather than surface-level interactions. You might notice a growing appreciation for slower, more intentional moments, time spent learning, reflecting, or simply observing the world around you. These changes can feel surprising at first. Sometimes people worry that shifting priorities mean they're losing ambition or direction. But in many cases, the opposite is happening. Your focus is becoming more refined. Instead of chasing every opportunity or expectation that appears, you begin choosing paths that align with your deeper values. This clarity can reshape daily life in subtle ways. You may become more selective about how you spend your time. Certain environments that once felt normal might now feel overwhelming or unnecessary. You might start gravitating toward activities that support your well-being rather than simply filling empty hours. As priorities evolve, decisions also become easier. When you know what truly matters to you, many distractions lose their influence. You're no longer trying to fit into someone else's version of success. Instead, you begin defining success in terms that feel authentic to your own experiences. This kind of shift doesn't require dramatic announcements. It simply unfolds through small choices made consistently over time. And those choices gradually build a life that feels more aligned with who you've become. The subtle confidence that comes from experience. Confidence is often misunderstood. Many people associate it with bold declarations, constant certainty, or the ability to appear completely unaffected by challenges. But the kind of confidence that develops through personal growth usually looks very different. It's quieter. It doesn't rely on proving anything to anyone. Instead, it grows from experience. When someone moves through a difficult chapter and learns from it, they begin carrying a deeper sense of stability. They've seen what uncertainty feels like. They've faced moments where they didn't know how things would turn out. And they discovered that they could still move forward. This realization creates a form of confidence that doesn't depend on perfect circumstances. It's not about believing that life will always go smoothly. It's about trusting that you can adapt, learn, and continue growing even when things become complicated. That kind of confidence changes how people approach the future. Instead of fearing every unknown outcome, they become more open to exploring possibilities. They're less likely to panic when something unexpected happens because they've already developed the ability to navigate uncertainty. This shift can also change the way people interact with others. They speak more honestly because they're less worried about immediate approval. They express their thoughts more calmly because they don't feel the need to defend their identity in every conversation. Confidence built through experience isn't loud. It's steady, and once it develops, it often becomes one of the strongest signs that someone has truly moved beyond the chapter that once challenged them. The identity shift that happens near the end of a difficult chapter. Near the end of a long and difficult season, something deeper than external change often begins to take place. It's not just about circumstances improving or challenges fading away. The more meaningful shift happens internally, in the way you see yourself and the way you understand your place in the world. Earlier chapters of life often revolve around proving something, proving your worth, proving your strength, proving that you can handle responsibilities, expectations, and pressures placed on you by others or even by yourself. But after moving through a truly demanding period, many people discover that they no longer feel the same need to prove anything. Instead, they begin focusing on understanding themselves more clearly. This shift might seem small on the surface, but it can reshape everything. When your identity stops revolving around constant validation or external pressure, you begin making decisions from a different place. Your choices become guided less by fear of failure and more by awareness of what genuinely supports your growth. You may notice yourself becoming more patient with the process of life. Situations that once triggered immediate reactions now invite thoughtful responses instead. You begin observing before judging, reflecting before responding. This level of awareness often develops only after someone has faced enough uncertainty to realize that rushing rarely leads to clarity. Identity transformation isn't something that happens in a single moment. It unfolds gradually through repeated experiences where you learn more about your values, your limits, and your strengths. And once that transformation begins to settle, life starts to feel less like a constant struggle and more like a process of steady progress. You're no longer trying to return to who you were before the difficult chapter began. You're stepping into someone new, someone shaped by experience, someone who understands their own direction more clearly. If this reflection connected with your own experiences, take a moment to share your thoughts below. What is one lesson you feel you've gained from a difficult chapter in your life? Your perspective might resonate with someone else who is currently going through a similar season, and conversations like these often create meaningful reminders that growth is rarely a journey people travel completely alone. And if you enjoy exploring ideas about personal awareness, resilience, and the quiet transformations that shape our lives, you're always welcome to be part of these conversations as they continue in future discussions here on the channel.